Hello again, and welcome to day 2 of Introduction to Computational Literary Analysis. This is lecture 2, where we're going to start to learn some coding. It's going to be awesome. Can't wait. Okay, here we go. All right, so first off, hopefully you've already done this, but you're going to want to go to anaconda.com and download and install Anaconda. Okay, so you're going to want to get the 64-bit graphical installer for your operating system, download it and install it. What you should be left with is something called Anaconda Navigator. Okay, now Anaconda Navigator looks a little bit like this. You have all of these buttons, and you're going to want to click on the one to install and eventually to launch JupyterLab. Okay, so there's Jupyter Notebook and there's JupyterLab. JupyterLab is newer, it's a little bit more modern, and this is the one that we're going to be using for coding in this class. There are all of these other environments that we're not going to be using, like the original notebook, like the console. You can play around with these if you want, but for this class we're almost always going to be using JupyterLab. So you click install there, you click launch, and what it should do is it should open a new page in your web browser. And it should look a little something like, I'm going to close some of the stuff for a second. It should look something like this. So if you're not here in a web page on your web browser, it means you need to come back to Anaconda Navigator and hit install and hit launch. Whole bunch of things should happen. It should open up a terminal, and it should finally open up this in your web browser. So you'll notice that it looks like a web page, but if you look at the URL, it's actually being run on your computer. So this is kind of like a local web page. It's running Python on your computer, but it looks like it's somewhere on the internet. So amazingly, you can use JupyterLab even when you don't have a connection to the internet, because it's not a real web page. It's actually just running on your computer. So there are all of these things that you can do here in JupyterLab. The thing that we're going to use the most is opening a notebook. So you open up a Python 3 notebook within JupyterLab, and it looks like this. It says untitled1.ipynb. This means it's a file called untitled1.ipynb, and it's somewhere on your system. It's good to know where on your system this is, and we'll get to that in a second. But this is an IPython notebook file, which is kind of like a hybrid between a text file and a Python file. So it contains both code and text describing the code. And so now, of course, this is really exciting if you have a hybrid course like Introduction to Computational Literary Analysis, because so much of what we do is hybrid to begin with, right? So we're talking about text, we're dealing with text, and we're also manipulating that with programs. And so JupyterLab and Jupyter Notebooks are a great way to combine those two things being computational analysis of a text and then prose discussion of that text. Okay, so let's take a look around JupyterLab and see if we can learn how to use this thing. So there are a whole bunch of buttons. We have this toolbar here, and we have this menu up here. First thing we want to look through is open up some of these tabs. You have one that is a file browser. You have one that will show you what kernel sessions you have running. So this means your Python code is going to be running inside one of these sessions. If something in your Python code is not working, maybe you want to shut it down, maybe you want to restart it. That's how you would do that. Here, we'll talk about that a little bit later. You have this, which is the command palette. Here you can search for and run Jupyter commands. Here you have property inspectors. Here you have a list of open tabs, and here you have extensions where you can add functionality to Jupyter. But for right now, let's come back here. I'm just going to increase the size of this thing a little bit so you can see it better in this video. Great. Is that too big? Okay, I'll keep it there. All right, so let's look around here a little bit. One of the first things that I like to do straight away is right-click on this tab and rename the notebook to something semantic. So I'm going to call it 00 Getting Started. And I'm going to rename the notebook to this. And I am naming it sequentially, so I'm starting with 00 just so everything appears in the order that I want it to appear in my file list. Okay, so now the first thing that I do is click inside this little box here called a cell. And now a cell can either be code, Python code, or it can be Markdown, which is just text with some fancy formatting. And it really matters what type your cell is. If your cell is type code, I can type something like print, and you can see that it's turned green, which means that it's interpreting what I'm typing as code. If I switch this to Markdown, I can write any arbitrary text I want, and I can write hello world, for example, and it's not going to interpret it as code, it's going to interpret it as text. So if it's code or if it's Markdown, I can run the cell. And what running the cell means is if it's Markdown, it will display it as text, like it's just done here. And I can go back by double-clicking. Or if it's code, it will try to execute it. So inside this cell, if I switch this cell to code, and if I try to run this cell by clicking the play button up here, it will say invalid syntax because this is not valid Python that I'm writing. So it's important to know what type your cell is because you can either trick your computer into thinking that what you're doing is writing prose when you're actually writing Python and vice versa. Okay, so Markdown is this kind of mini programming language that allows you to write using formatting using a few special characters. So one of these is this pound sign. So if I write a pound sign and then a space that says what I'm about to write is a header. So I'm going to call this Getting Started. Now you see it's highlighted it as blue because it understands it as a header. This is automatic syntax highlighting of Markdown. So I like to start every notebook with at least a header and then at least a little something like a small sentence or a paragraph describing what the notebook is. So I can say, in this notebook, I'm going to show you a few basics of how to get around JupyterLab and how to use code cells. Now, so Markdown allows me to do a lot of neat things. I can say I can italicize text using Markdown by surrounding text with stars. I can boldface text too. I can show inline code using backticks, and lots more. So this stuff is all important because you're going to want to know how to italicize something like the moonstone when you're writing the name of the text, the moonstone. And since we're going to be using Jupyter notebooks for our final projects, being familiar with Markdown is a good thing. So how do we learn everything we can about Markdown? Well, we have a couple of useful references. I open one of these I think it's commands, I can search for Markdown. So I can say Markdown here, and it comes up, it's in the help menu. So you can also access this right here. If I click on Markdown reference, it tells me a little bit about Markdown, and it says, here are a few different things that you can write in plain text, and here's how it will be translated into Markdown. So I can include links, I can include images, I can include list items, all kinds of stuff. And there's also a little 10-minute interactive tutorial that you can play with. So if I click here, it says begin lesson, and I can try to insert headings. You know, I can make each of these chapters a level 2 heading. It's kind of a fun game. Anyway, I'm going to close this. You can sort of do that on your own time if you want. But now back to this Markdown cell. If I press play here, if I press run, you can see it just formats this Markdown cell. So if I double click on this, it shows me the source code for this, so to speak. And if I run it, it shows me how it's formatted. Another way that I can run a cell is I can press Shift Enter, and that runs the cell and takes me to the next cell. So that's really handy. I can press Control Enter, and it just runs that cell. So it's nice to know all of these keyboard shortcuts too, because you're going to want to get fast enough at this so that it stays out of the way and you're not switching back and forth to the mouse all the time. So another reference for this is you come over here to commands. I can type keyboard shortcuts. I'm sure there's something in the help about this somewhere. JupyterLab reference. It's around somewhere. Yeah, I might have to get back to you on that. Anyway, you can actually navigate JupyterLab pretty thoroughly using only the keyboard. For example, I can open this command console by pressing Control-Shift-C. There are lots of things that you can do. Okay, so again, this is a Markdown cell, and this is a code cell. I look up here and I can verify that it's a code cell, and now I can type my first program. First, I'm going to sort of annotate ahead of time. Now I'm going to write my first program. If you already know how to program, or if you already know how to program in Python, some of this stuff might be a little boring, but bear with me, it's not going to last too long. So the program that everyone learns when they're beginning programming is called Hello World. And everyone learns this, and the object of the program is just to print the words Hello World on the screen. So to do that, you use this function called print. Print just shows some text on the screen. It prints it out to output. So I'm going to write print. I'm going to have these two parentheses here, and inside these parentheses I'm going to write double quotes, and I'm going to write Hello World. You'll see that Python and Jupyter, it automatically completed the quotes. You know, so I typed one pair of quotes and it finished with another pair of quotes. That's kind of handy. So print Hello World. Let's if you've typed this exactly as I've typed it, you should be able to come up here, hit run, and it should say Hello World right beneath. So what we have here is, this is cell number 2. This is the source code for cell number 2, and this down here is the output for cell number 2. So if I made a mistake somewhere, so let's say, for example, I have a single quote here and double quotes over here. Or let's say, for example, I forgot the ending parenthesis. If I were to run this code cell now, it says syntax error, end of line while scanning, string literal, and it shows me with this little caret, it shows me where the problem is. So I can go back and fix it. I can say, put quotation marks there. Now at put 2, I have to delete one in parenthesis. And it's turned green, which tells me that it recognizes it as something that's probably going to work even before I run it. So I can run this again by pressing Shift-Enter, or I can run it by coming up here and clicking the button that looks like play. Okay, so let's talk about for a second everything that's going on here. So this is what's called a function. So this is the print function. And when I want a function to run, I have to put parentheses after it. Now, I don't have to put anything inside necessarily. I can just say print with parentheses, and this will run, but it doesn't do anything but print a blank line. So you see I just have a blank line here. If I put something inside these parentheses, that takes what I'm writing here, hello world, and it passes it to the print function. So the print function takes this text from inside the parentheses and it prints it out to the output. Okay, so that's what a function looks like, and this is what's known as a function call. So I'm executing a tiny program here by saying hello world is my string, and I'm putting it inside these parentheses in a call to print. So a few things to note here are you should not have a space between the function name and the parentheses. It should just be the function name, and it should be hello world in parentheses coming right after the function. Sometimes Python will be forgiving and will execute something anyway, even if you forget and you put a space there, but it's really not recommended. This is the standard practice way of doing things. Okay, so we ran our first program. It says hello world, and we should all applaud ourselves because this is a great accomplishment, and we've done something really wonderful. Now, let's kick it up a notch. Let me show you a few more things about this interface before we get into some more Python stuff. Okay, so we've got the environment set up. We've downloaded Anaconda. We launched JupyterLab. Oh yeah, so one thing that we want to make sure is make sure that you're running Python 3. If you see over here it says Python 3, and in the beginning we were given the option of launching a notebook. We always want to choose a Python 3 notebook because Python 2 is an older version of Python. The syntax is a little bit different. It will run differently, and it won't really be compatible with most of the stuff that we're doing in class. So make sure that you're using Python 3 wherever you're given the option and not Python 2. Okay, so we're looking around JupyterLab. I've shown you a few of these things already. We saw the command palette. I told you about code cell types. Let's talk a second about the file manager and knowing where we are. So when I say where we are, I mean we are right now in a directory and working within a directory. On my computer, we're in a directory called notes. And these are the other files in that directory. I have this pip file, which sets up a Python environment. I won't really get into that. We have this Python notebook 00 getting started. We have another Python notebook here called Untitled. And this is a little mini file manager over here on the side. I can take one of these files, I can delete it. I can rename other files if I want to over here. I can add a new file. I can add a new markdown file, a new folder. What I can't do from this interface is change into a different folder. So wherever you are when JupyterLab starts, that's the directory that you're working in, and those are the files that you have access to. If you want to use a file, or if you want to load a file that's somewhere else on your computer, you need to move that file to this working directory. so the directory that you happen to be in right now. So how do you know what directory you are in? So let's write about this. We'll call this about files and current working directories. How do you know what directory you are working in? So one way is to use the %pwd so-called magic command. So here I'm going to press Shift-Enter again, and that's going to format that markdown. How do you know what directory you're working in? So I can type $pwd, this stands for print working directory, and I can press Shift-Enter here, making sure that it's a code cell. I can come up here and press Run, and it tells me that this is the directory that I'm in on my computer. This is the path to all of these files that I'm looking at. So if I want to add files, I would add them to this directory using my file manager somehow. I can also list all of the files in this directory with the ls command. Let me annotate that. So in a new markdown cell, I could say this command lists all the files in this current directory. And it's %ls, and it tells me that I have files 00 getting started. It shows me all of the files that I have in my current working directory. Okay, so it's okay if you don't get all of this stuff now, because we're going to go over this a little bit later in a unit about files. But it's important to know that the file manager is here, and that if you want to work with the file, make sure that it's in this directory so that JupyterLab can see it. Okay, so we looked all around JupyterLab. We got our environment set up. We wrote hello world, and we looked at the anatomy of that function call. Now I want to show you probably the most important thing in this lecture. I'm going to annotate this in Markdown, and I'm going to call this Your Friends Debugging and Help Tools. Okay, so you are going to run into errors at some point, and at some point you're going to want documentation. You're going to want to know how functions work, what functions can you use. You're going to want to know what kinds of things can I give to a function. And all of these things are available in the very friendly Python interface. And I'm going to show you a few different ways to get help. So one is use the inspector, otherwise known as the contextual help tool. Okay, so to get contextual help, I come over here to commands. I start typing contextual help, and you see I also have the option of pressing Control-I. But if I click Show Contextual Help here, a new tab opens up, and I can close this, and now I have two tabs here. I can open up the notebook, getting started, or I can show the contextual help. So I can also move this tab. I can move it to the right, I can move it down. I like to move it to the right sometimes. You can also move it down underneath all of this stuff. Oops. Oh, I just lost. Okay, there we go. This is a little buggy on my end. Okay, so I've just moved contextual help down to the bottom there. So what happens now when I am interested to know how a function might work, or how to use a function rather? If I come up here to my code cell area, and if I look at this little mini program, and if I put my cursor anywhere around here, you can see that the contextual help has pulled up this nice little documentation window where it says, here's the doc string. In other words, here's the help about the print function. It says here what the print function does. It says it prints the values to a stream or to sys.standardout by default. And it says it takes keyword arguments that are optional. It says the first one is a file, or file-like object. It says it can take a separator, and it says it can take what it adds to the end. And it can say whether or not to flush the output. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. So that means that, yeah, we could write, if we wanted to, another print statement that says hello world, but we could give it some of these optional arguments, so using that example, we could say end equals, and then we could give it like a whole bunch more exclamation marks, and now it says hello world with a whole bunch of exclamation marks at the end. So what I've written here is a function call with two arguments. So the first one is a positional argument, hello world. It's just the string hello world. And the second one is a keyword argument where the keyword here is end. And I'm passing it a string. So in other words, there are two things that I'm giving to this print function. And the print function just sort of figures out what to do with those two things. So anyway, we've just discovered that contextual help is really useful, and it just helps to have this open all the time, really. Yeah, it used to be called the inspector, now it's called contextual help. I am really into it. Okay. So yeah, that's your first friend, the inspector. So your second friend is this help function, which pretty much does the same thing, only it prints it out to the notebook instead of showing you in the contextual help. So I could say help print, and here I'm just giving it the name of the function. I'm not giving it parentheses. And it will print out basically the same thing that we saw before. But this is kind of handy too. If you don't have access to contextual help for some reason, help function is pretty nice. So what are other friends that we can use? Yet a third one is just type a value in an empty cell and run it to see that value. Okay, so let's see how that works. Let's say I have the string hello world, and we know it's a string because it's enclosed in quotation marks. If I were to just run this as is, it would show me the value of that string, which is just hello world. Okay, so this doesn't tell us a whole lot, but I can assign this to a variable. I could say greeting equals hello world. And what this does is it assigns this string over here, hello world, it gives it a name, and that name is greeting. So I'm going to annotate what I've just done here and say, here I'm assigning the string hello world to the variable name greeting. Okay, so if I run this, nothing happens. It's just silently succeeded. So it's taken this hello world string and it's assigned it to a variable called greeting. Now we can write greeting, just the word greeting, and we can run this, and it will show you the contents of the variable greeting. So it shows us hello world. Okay, if we were to write something else, something that wasn't a variable, so not a greeting, for example, if I were to write that, it says name error, name not a greeting is not defined. That's because we haven't given anything this name yet. If I were to assign this to something else, like the number 2345, and then I were to write not a greeting, it would then show me the value of this variable, which is 2345. I'm going to add one more thing here. I'm going to say use the type function to find the type of something. Okay, so everything in Python has a type. Let's see what is the type of this thing called the string hello world. It says str, which is short for string. I could say, what is the type of this number 2345? It says that is an int, which is short for integer. I could say, what is the type of 2345 in quotation marks? Now, this is a crucial difference here because it says this is a string. So Python, in other words, differentiates between an integer, which is number, right, and a string, which might contain numbers, but really is text. So you can do some things with numbers that you can't do with text and vice versa. And converting between integers and strings and other data types is sort of one of the big challenges to wrap your head around when you're first starting out with programming. So I'll show you some examples. 2345 plus 1. This will work, and it will just add 1 to the number 2345. If I press Shift Enter here, it says 2346. So already you can imagine you can use Python as sort of a calculator. Other arithmetic operations also work. You can subtract 1. However, if I do something like this, 2345, in quotation marks and subtract 1, it will say unsupported operand types for minus string and integer. So it says you can't subtract a number from some text. It doesn't know how to do that. However, you can convert between these by using functions like int and str. So I'm going to just annotate that. I can say use int and str to convert between int and str types. So for example, if I have 2345 and I write str around this, it will give me the quoted version. It'll give me a string for that. If I were to write int of 2345 in quotation marks, then it gives me the integer version of that. So what I can do is I could say 2345, give me that integer, and then add 1, and that will work. So this is a crucial distinction that we have to keep in mind because a lot of errors will come when we just don't quite have the right type, or when we're trying to do something with types that is unsupported. So I'll show you what I mean. So if we have 2, 3, 4, 5 as a string, and if I add 1 as a string, you might imagine that you'll get the answer 2, 3, 4, 6, but what you actually get is it combines these two strings. So it just takes this string, pretends it's text, and combines it over here. So you can imagine that what plus does is actually two things. It can add numbers, or it can add strings together, smush the strings together, that's the technical term, concatenate them together into one. So if I have a string hello, and if I have another string world, I can run this and it concatenates them together. It puts them all together. And you'll notice it doesn't automatically put a space. So if we wanted to do that, we would have to say hello plus space plus world, and that would get us a space-separated phrase. And there's so many other things that we can do with strings that we won't get into right now because I don't want to overload you, but this will give you a taste of the kinds of things that you can start doing right now with JupyterLab. So I would recommend that once you have JupyterLab set up, that you just kind of run through everything, look through all of the menus, see how it works, try to, maybe read some of the references if you want, or don't, that's fine too. Click on all of the things that you can click on, just see what everything does, look through all of the commands that you can run, and just play around with it a little bit. So open up a new code cell and try a few things, like try adding a couple of numbers together and just see what happens, or try adding a couple of strings together and just see what happens. And if you're curious about what something does, again, your 4 friends here are to use the inspector, to use the help function, to type a value in an empty cell and run it to see that value, or to use the type function to find the type of something. Okay, great. That's all for now, and I look forward to talking with you about this in the Zulip chat shortly.